Alrighty, so welcome everybody. We are super excited to have you in this space for our March LunchBox talk, which is entitled Deepening Our Understanding of Substance Use in the Context of HIV. My name is Jen Balkus. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an epidemiologist with Public Health Seattle King County's HIV, STI, and Hepatitis C program. My co-host, Roxanne Karani from University of Washington, hopefully should be joining us shortly. She's having some Zoom issues today. Well, we're going to go ahead and get things started. So we'll have two presenters, two fantastic doctoral students or doctoral candidates, excuse me, from the Department of Epidemiology at the University of Washington School of Public Health, who both have been working on this topic for the last several years. And so the structure of today is Kaitlin Zinsli is going to be presenting first, and then which will be about 20-ish minutes. Well, if there's clarifying questions or sort of really targeted questions for Kaitlin, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll take a moment to do brief questions after that. Then we'll switch to Mike Berry's talk, and then we'll do a larger save time for a larger discussion at the end. So Kaitlin, why don't you go ahead and pull up your slides? And as you do that, I'm excited to share a little bit of a fun fact about Kaitlin, as we're talking about at the beginning, is that in undergrad, she was a pole vaulter. Which is a super awesome and incredibly challenging athletic event. So let you get things set up. That looks great. And we will turn things over to you. Welcome, Kaitlin.
Thank you for having me. So today I'm just going to be presenting on some drug testing results from dried blood spot specimens among people who use drugs at 6 United States syringe service programs. Sorry, having issues hitting next for some reason. One moment.
No problem. We'll give Kaitlin a moment to see if we can get those we just tried before everyone joined us.
Sorry about that. I'm just trying to switch displays really quick.
No worries.
Okay, swap. I guess maybe if you want to like switch and go first, and I can try and figure this out. Sorry about that, everybody.
Yep, no problem. I feel like no matter how many times we all do this, Zoom always has a curveball for us. So you are in good company with that.
Thanks, Mike.
We will switch over to Mike. Why don't you get your slides ready, and I will share Mike's fun fact, which is that he had driven the entirety of Interstate 90 across the U.S. and the entirety of Interstate I-5 down the West Coast.
And I have a hybrid now, so.
And you, oh, good.
Harm reduction. Well, thanks. Thank you, Jen, for the intro, and thank you, Jen and Roxanne, for having me. As Jen mentioned earlier, I'm a doctoral candidate of epidemiology here at UW, he, him pronouns, and I'm presenting on my first dissertation aim, which is a qualitative study of methamphetamine use patterns among cisgender men and trans and gender diverse people who have sex with men, and the implications of our findings for the development of a quantitative epi questionnaire. So a lot to cover, so I'll be as quick as I can be so Kaitlin has plenty of time. So I just want to acknowledge that I am a cisgender white queer man I do not have lived experience using methamphetamine, but I do have many years of experience providing public health and social services to people who use drugs and who are also part of the LGBTQ+ community. You'll see lots of terms in my slideshow because it wouldn't be a public health study if we didn't have lots of contractions. So MSM is probably familiar to this group, refers to cisgender men who have sex with men. TNB refers to trans, non-binary, and other gender diverse people. MTSM refers to MSM plus those TNB folks who also have sex with men, the topic of this research. Meth is methamphetamine because methamphetamine is too many syllables. And chemsex refers to the use of drugs, often meth, but not just meth, that is meant to facilitate or enhance sexual experiences. And SUD in this context refers to a stimulant use disorder. So briefly, what do we know about this public health issue of meth among MTSM populations? So we know that meth use among MSM in the US is increasing. If you were at Croy, you saw some recent work that I did with Matt and Sarah and a few other folks on this call. We have limited data, but it appears that meth use is quite high, disproportionately high among TNB populations in the US. To give you a sense, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health estimates about 1%, and the overall US population and studies among MSM and TNB populations estimate like 6 to 20% 1 year period prevalence of meth use. So quite profound disparities there. We know that meth leads to some devastating health outcomes, including overdose death, but also irreversible cognitive declines, mental health, psychotic symptomatology, cardiovascular issues, and particularly in this population, HIV. So we know that meth is a major contributor to HIV transmission and acquisition among MTSM. What is not terribly well described yet, which this is kind of like my brain on a slide, these are the questions that I want to answer with my research. How often do MTSM try meth or initiate meth use? Besides chemsex, what are the other contexts in which people in this population are using meth? What does progression of meth use from first trying it to developing a stimulant use disorder look like? How commonly do people use meth without ever developing a stimulant use disorder? What factors influence these two distinct trajectories with meth and other potential meaningful trajectories that are out there? And can we intervene in meth sooner than once it's taken hold as a stimulant use disorder? So to kind of orient these questions in this particular research, these green stars indicate questions that I think we're answering at least somewhat with this work. Yellow stars indicate questions that I hope we can answer throughout my dissertation work and the subsequent studies from this one. And this red star is really like a big career question that I don't know if I can answer while a PhD student, but maybe in the future. So this qualitative project was designed leveraging CBPR, community-based participatory research principles, where we sought to center the perspectives of people who have used meth and or provide services to other people who do. So we included Peer Seattle and the Seattle LGBTQ+ Center's Project Neon. Those are both peer-led, peer-organized harm reduction / recovery groups that are meant to provide services to people who use meth, primarily gay and bisexual cis men, but also gender diverse people. We also sought to invert those kind of conventional power dynamics between academia and community, where we really tried to make sure that community partners felt like they had a very strong voice of leadership in the work. We used a semi-structured interview guide to conduct 45 to 75-minute qualitative interviews. We developed the guides with a phenomenological framework, which essentially means we wanted to understand people's own perspectives on their lived experiences with meth. And we provided every participant a $60 gift card for about an hour of their time. And the goal of this study was to use qualitative findings about a not terribly well-described phenomenon to develop a questionnaire that can distinguish meth use trajectories using cross-sectional data. And of course, there's other longer-term goals, but this is kind of the immediate dissertation-specific goal. We had 49 participants. 59% were cisgender men, about 1/3 were non-binary, gender fluid, or agender. And then the remaining participants were either transgender men or transmasculine or transgender women. We had I think a racially, ethnically diverse group of folks. Again, this is folks living in King, Snohomish, and or Pierce County who identified as cisgender, MSM, or MTSM. And for racial and ethnic description, we asked folks to self-describe in their own words how they perceive their race or ethnicity, and then many people appear in more than one cell here. About 1/5 of participants reported either experiencing homelessness or housing instability. And we had quite a range of age, so as young as 22, as old as 66, with a median of 40, kind of right in the middle. Folks had as many as 41 years since their first meth use experience, and as little as in the year preceding their interview. And folks also reported trying meth for the first time at quite a spread of ages, although most were under 22, between 14 and 22. But the person who was oldest at their first meth use experience was 50. So the meat of the presentation is getting into these qualitative themes, and then finally what we'll do about our findings with putting together a questionnaire. So first, we found that MTSM were introduced to meth in a variety of settings and contexts, that the frequency, volume, and administration routes or methods of taking the drug were widely varied over time, of course, across the population, but also within individuals, which is an interesting finding in my opinion. And then lastly, individuals who reported developing a stimulant use disorder or having stimulant use disorder evidence, those folks generally reported a really key kind of salient use experience that they attributed sort of this change in their relationship to meth, and that was really often in the context of life stressors. So for this next section, I'm gonna present several quotes that kind of match up with each theme. Some of them are very long, so I'm going to go quickly because I want to get through everything. So for a couple, I've just kind of made some points, but for the longer ones, I'll pause for a moment so folks can read them. So this first a quick note on this first theme. So I think our finding that people had widely varied experiences with their first meth use experience was kind of counter to what I expected, which was a lot or most people would report chemsex. Most people actually did not report using meth for the first time in the context of sex. And it seems like maybe that first use experience context could be predictive of what comes next for people. So I'll start with this first participant who talked about his first time using meth in the context of sex, seeking a sex partner, not really knowing much about meth culture, and having a really positive time with his first meth use. So this person, to me, kind of thinking about my experience working with the health department and HIV partner services, this experience sounds a lot like a lot of the folks who I spoke with in HIV partner services, trying meth for the first time, having a great experience, and something that I was concerned that I would find a lot of. But indeed, this is one of many types of experiences that people described. So this next participant here was not in a sexual context, did not have a necessarily very positive experience with meth, and didn't think about using it for many years after. So we have these two people, both in their early 20s, age 22, at their first experience. and having these really different responses to meth, again, in different contexts. This next participant here that I want to highlight, he had a positive first experience. So he describes sort of immediately being hooked on meth, but outside of a sexual context with a friend, and later on goes on to talk about how he really quickly went out to seek more meth. And again, age 22, interesting that all these are happening around the same time of development for folks. And then lastly, this participant here talks about they worked in a strip club and they were offered all kinds of drugs at work. They thought that they were trying cocaine, but actually it was meth. Not a great experience, and actually never tried meth again. So we have these 4, not exhaustive, but really different responses to a first meth use experience. And all 4 of these people go on to describe different relationships with meth over time, which I think is quite interesting. So theme 2, that the frequency, volume, and methods of taking methamphetamine over time vary for individuals. So there's some evidence of this natural history of folks kind of reaching this point with meth where they kind of get tired of using it and they move on to other drugs or to sobriety. But there's a lot kind of that happens in the middle from starting to finishing one's tenure with meth. So some folks talk about their ramp up with use or their increasing in use can be very gradual and slow, or it can happen very fast, as kind of hinted at with many of those quotes I just presented. Cessation, by the same token, can be gradual, very slow, or abrupt, and that's influenced by lots of things that you'll see evidence of. In kind of in the same vein, some people report developing evidence of a stimulant use disorder, while others just take breaks, don't use very often, kind of just use on the weekends, or decide to just end their relationship to meth. I'm going to give folks a moment to read this rather long quote. I think this person makes several points that came up with other interviews. So this purple section here, using daily for a couple of days, stop for a week or 2 and do it again. There's this sort of cyclical relationship that this person reports having with meth. He also talks about maybe a lack of prospects and seeking out sexual intimacy or connections online. And oftentimes those interactions are characterized by meth use, and that sort of is part of this cycle. This next participant and what's not presented here, but this participant here talked about his experience as a trans man. Part of what attracted him to meth was seeking a connection with cisgender gay men. So we didn't have necessarily enough perspective from trans folks to speak at length about the trans specific experience, but just something interesting that I think is worth looking into in later work is how the sort of perceptions around meth as a sex drug for cisgender gay men may influence the experience of gender diverse folks who have masculine gender expression. What I also thought was interesting here was this person talks about sort of this co-addiction with meth and sex. And then later also using meth during these really long breaks from work. And then sort of a different perspective here, this person talks about how he primarily used meth with one sex partner. And then once that relationship ended, he felt like he had a lot of negative attachments to meth and just kind of got over it. And later on in our interview, he talked about how avoiding meth became very central in his search for partnership, and how it's something he really does not have interest in going back to, which I think is very different than folks who talk about developing this addiction or evidence of stimulant use disorder. So moving on to this third theme here. So I mentioned that a lot of folks who develop the stimulant use disorder talk about these kind of inflection points in their relationship to meth. So I just want to point out the progression to stimulant use disorder was not universal. Many participants talked about feeling in control and being able to take breaks and just kind of fully ending their relationship to meth. Of course, others did not. And so this first person here, they talk about how they had this really long break after their first experience with meth, which was rather fleeting. And then they were in this life circumstance. They talked about being a nurse throughout the early days of the COVID pandemic, and also having their own mental health issues that they feel like influence their desire to seek escape from that stress through meth. And this was a really common story, this sort of specific bad things happening in one's personal life, kind of encouraging them to seek out ways to escape, and especially during COVID, where folks felt quite isolated. What I'll point out about this participant is that his first experience was when he was quite young. This happened about 15 years after that first experience, which was very fleeting. So he hadn't thought about or used meth for many years. And then in the context of this very stressful situation, taking care of his partner, in trying to support himself and his partner and pay for his new house, he was not in a good place and found himself sort of self-medicating with meth and feeling like it made it easier for him to show up to work, be energized, talk to people. So there's this sort of maybe kind of insidious way that meth kind of snuck into this person's life. Again, outside of the context of sex, right? Just seeking an opportunity to kind of function, in his words, kind of normally. This last quote that I want to highlight here. So again, this person has had, he talks about taking breaks over time, but then eventually when he was feeling depressed, the more stress that he was under, the more seeking meth as an escape became attractive. So this is a lot to try to illustrate in under 20 minutes, and I have about 2 minutes left, so I want to make sure that I finish up the presentation here. But really, what we take away from these findings are that this quantitative questionnaire that we are in the process of developing should measure timing of first experience. So using participant information, how old was the participant, when did this happen? And this timing of first experience can kind of ground the rest of the experience in how long from day of survey one first used meth, and therefore how much opportunity they've had to use meth again, and how much time has passed for their relationship to meth to really evolve over time. The context of the first experience we think is quite important. Whether they do go back and use meth again, some participants in the qualitative study did not. And then, of course, when their last experience with meth was it recent? Was it remote? How are folks using meth? So are they smoking? Are they eventually injecting? Are they using rectal insertion or other methods? Which other drugs are using it with? Whether use has increased monotonically, kind of petered out, or fluctuated over time. If people have taken breaks, what have those breaks looked like? Have they been self-initiated? Have they been sought out with the support of things like detox or treatment? What did binging patterns look like? Are folks primarily using in binges and then taking long breaks or not? And of course, what stressful factors could be influencing use frequency? So the next steps for me and my committee members and co-authors are to finalize a questionnaire, which is in progress, and then conduct cognitive interviews. So essentially see if the questionnaire makes sense to folks by meeting with probably about 15 to 20 individuals with a history of meth use and refining the language and ordering of questions. And then once that's complete, launching the questionnaire online and collecting data from hopefully many hundreds or over 1,000 people. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank the UW Population Health Initiative for funding this project, my community partner agencies, Pierce Seattle and the LGBTQ+ Center, and my co-authors, including my dissertation chair, Dr. Golden, Jack and Zachary, Jesse, for helping with interviews. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was really, really interesting, and yeah, exciting to see what you've done so far and also to see where you're headed. Let's take a pause for a quick moment before we transition to Kaitlin's talk to take if there's any sort of specific clarifying questions or more targeted questions for Mike, and then otherwise we can save sort of the larger discussion till after our second talk. And folks, also feel free to use the chat as well if you've got questions as we go that Mike may be able to answer. Okay, seeing none, we will bring Kaitlin back.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for stepping in so quickly. So let's see. Does that look okay to everybody?
That looks great.
Sweet.
And then you want to try to advance just to make sure we're good?
Yes, it looks like it.
Yay.
Still a little slow, it looks like, but
at least we're going somewhere. All right, awesome.
Yeah.
Great, Kaitlin, over to you.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so it might just be like a little delayed, but yeah, I'll get started. So this is going to be using results from the Project Needle Exchange Utilization Survey. And this is looking at drug testing results from dried blood spot specimens among people who used drugs at 6 United States syringe service programs. Still running into difficulties for some reason. Okay, try this
Jen,
one more time.
does someone else have Caitlin's slides?
Yeah, I did
Yeah.
send the slides to both Jen and Roxanne.
Yep, I have your slides, Kaitlin. Do you want me to share?
That would be great. I'm so sorry to everyone
No
for
worries.
computer difficulties.
You're good. All right, let me get this going.
It's apparently a day for technical difficulties.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to figure this out for sure for the future.
So you should be seeing, hopefully you're seeing that, and I will make it big. Does that look good for everybody?
That
Okay.
looks great. So you can continue to the next slide. All right, so just some background on Project Nexus in general. This was a multi-site cross-sectional surveillance survey of people who use drugs that was conducted in syringe service programs in the United States from June 2021 to July 2022. And this was primarily done as a collaborative effort between the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the University of Washington, which aimed to create a national program for monitoring of syringe service program services as well as client impacts. Next slide. And just to start off with kind of how these SSPs were sampled, there was a 2-stage site sampling procedure that was followed. So the first 4 of the SSPs out of 33 that were approached were selected based on these 5 categories that I have listed on the slide. And these included the setting, urban, suburban versus rural, US Census region, which included East, South, Midwest, and West, length of operation, so less than 5 years versus 5 years or longer, the syringe distribution model, so needs-based versus all others, and then the health department affiliation. And so these categories were essentially used to kind of try and get at a diversity of SSPs across these different categories. And it basically, once they selected those first 4 SSPs, it kind of reached this point where it was taking a little bit longer than anticipated. And so at this point, a request for proposals was opened in order to increase the sample size. And this was when 2 additional SSPs were selected for a total of 6. Next slide. So in terms of participant recruitment, participants were recruited by SSP staff through peer referral and through word of mouth. Incentivized peer referrals were used, aka snowball sampling, and participants received up to 4 $10 incentive cards per peer referral. And this really helped to expand survey reach to people who use drugs who did not use the SSPs, which was important for getting kind of a diversified sample. To be eligible, participants had to be 18 years of age or older, able to complete the survey in English, injected or used injection drugs via a non-injection route in the past 6 months, and to have not previously participated in the survey. Next slide. In terms of data collected during this study, participants completed a detailed behavioral interview that collected demographic and behavioral characteristics. They completed antibody testing for both HIV and hepatitis C virus. And then they also collected 5 dried blood spots on paper filters. And originally these were collected primarily for hepatitis C RNA testing, but there were quite a few left over after this testing. And so a total of 1,381 participants consented to their samples being used for future research, as well as had sufficient dried blood spot specimens left over for further testing. Next slide. And so we were able to use these kind of additional dried blood spot specimens for additional substance use testing. So we collaborated with the Center for Forensic Science Research and Education, who developed these assays for 5 different substances, and that included cocaine, fentanyl, heroin, methamphetamine, and xylazine. And we were able to, in secondary analyses, use these DBS test results to look at positive DBS test results by region of the United States, as well as prevalence of polysubstance use. Next slide. And I just wanted to go into a tiny bit more detail about the assays themselves here. So they really only evaluated the presence/absence based off of the cutoff concentrations that are listed in this table on the right-hand side. And you can also see there's 2 additional rows here, and that's because 2 metabolites were used and combined into single measures to measure both heroin use and cocaine use. Next slide. And I won't go into too much of the demographic characteristics for the purpose of this presentation, but I did kind of want to give a general overview of what the study population looked like. So just pointing out some things here. Proportionally, most of the participants fell between the ages of 30 and 59. Non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic Black, African American, and Hispanic race ethnicities were proportionally the most common. 62% of the population were men, and 69% reported experiencing homelessness in the past 6 months. Next slide. And I also wanted to throw up a slide just on the reported route of administration of substances in the past 6 months. And you can see here that primarily most of the population, 70%, reported both injection and non-injection drug use in the past 6 months. 23% reported non-injection drug use only in the past 6 months, and 8% reported injection drug use only. Next slide. So this is the table that kind of displays the substance positivity by study site based off of those dried blood spot test results. And so the way this table is laid out is on the far left side, it's more of the Western sites. And as you follow the table over to the right, it's the more Eastern sites. I've also color coded it so that the darker colors indicate a higher proportion of people testing positive for that substance. So just zoning in on the Ellensburg column on the left here, you can see that proportionally most of the population, 94%, tested positive for methamphetamine. followed not so closely by heroin at 22%, fentanyl at 21%, cocaine at 18%, and no one at this site tested positive for xylazine at that time. So zooming a little bit back out to look at kind of some broader takeaways from this table, kind of as we might expect, we're seeing proportionally higher amounts of methamphetamine use in the Western sites, and higher proportions of people testing positive for cocaine among the Eastern sites. Just pointing out some other things that we found interesting. Among the Western sites, Sacramento had the highest proportion of people testing positive for cocaine, and among the Eastern sites, Wilmington saw the highest proportion of people testing positive for methamphetamine. Looking at New Haven, they saw the highest proportion of people test positive for fentanyl, 52%, and then the highest proportion of people test positive for xylazine at 32%. Next slide. And so we were also interested in looking at co-positivity as kind of a measure of polysubstance use as well. And so I attempted to make these heat maps, and the legend on the left shows that kind of the darker colors indicate a higher proportion of co-positivity for two substances. So right here, I'm displaying just the first row of the table, looking at all sites combined. 833 people tested positive for cocaine among all sites. And so if you move to the next column in the table, 28% of those people tested positive for just cocaine. 42% of those 833 people also tested positive for fentanyl. 24% also tested positive for heroin. 43% also tested positive for meth, and 21% also tested positive for xylazine. So if you hit next, so you can see that the table will proceed like this. So 394 people tested positive for fentanyl, and you can kind of see it pops out pretty quickly that 88% or so of people testing positive for fentanyl also tested positive for cocaine. Over 40% also tested positive for heroin and meth, and 36% tested positive for xylazine as well. Next, please. And looking at the 257 people that tested positive for heroin, over 60% also tested positive for cocaine, fentanyl, and methamphetamine at all of the sites combined. And next. Looking at methamphetamine, 819 people tested positive for meth, and we actually see the highest proportion of mono use among this population. 45% of people only tested positive for methamphetamine. And then kind of looking at the cocaine column, we saw that 44% of those people also tested positive for cocaine, less so for the other three substances. And then looking at xylazine, what kind of pops out first is that 91% of those people testing positive for xylazine also tested positive for cocaine, and 75% also tested positive for fentanyl. And so basically when we created this table, after kind of seeing that those DBS results initially by site really were different by region, we also wanted to look at this co-positivity, basically just comparing those Western and Eastern sites to see what those differences would look like. So if you hit next. So this is the same table, but now it's only among Ellensburg, Sacramento, and Missoula. And you can already kind of see a difference here. Obviously, you saw earlier that a very high proportion of people tested positive for methamphetamine at those three sites. So as you might expect, among people testing positive for cocaine, fentanyl, heroin, and xylazine, we're seeing almost everyone also testing positive for methamphetamine. Less so for the other substances, just pointing out a few things. Among fentanyl, heroin, and xylazine, people testing positive for those, we saw over 45% also testing positive for cocaine, and less people testing positive for xylazine for all of these substances. Next slide. And you can already see the difference here, as you might expect when looking at the Eastern sites. So this is Madison, Wilmington, and New Haven. You're seeing among people testing positive for fentanyl, heroin, methamphetamine, and xylazine, over 80% are testing positive for cocaine as well. Among people testing positive for heroin, 96% also tested positive for fentanyl. And similarly, when you looked at the xylazine row, 83% of those individuals also tested positive for fentanyl. Next slide. So just some conclusions based off of these results. The substance use prevalence that we saw did echo previously described regional trends that we might have expected, especially these Western versus Eastern trends where we're seeing proportionally more methamphetamine use in the Western sites and more cocaine use among the Eastern sites. We also saw that polysubstance use was relatively common, which has also been echoed in the literature recently. And I think it would be really interesting if future research could explore whether dried blood spots might be useful as supporting elements to drug surveillance systems, especially as rapid surveillance is very necessary to develop effective and tailored interventions to reduce harms, especially in the context of so many new emerging substances. Next slide. And I just want to acknowledge Project Nexus, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Center for Forensic Science Research and Education, and Public Health Seattle and King County. And we'll take any questions. Thank you so much for your time.